Welcome back to the Deep 404. Overnight, we've seen a continuation of Ukraine's use of ATACMS missiles on areas within Russia. In the Kursk region, we have here a little example of this, which looks like it was a very close call for whoever was filming this. Apparently someone working at the Kursk airbase. Just see if we can get this to play. So cluster munitions in use there, and you can see they got very close. I'll just replay that part. Here you go. Frightening. Anyhow, so we have a continuation of the use of these weapons. There we go. Let's turn this light on. You can see things a bit better. There we go. A continuation of the use of the ATACMS missiles into Russia. This is after the Russians sent a clear signal with the Oreshnik missile after it had first happened. Still, we see the West wanting to poke the bear, as they say. This attack, I believe, occurred on an airbase in Kursk. Apparently, the airbase is no longer being used for aircraft, so I don't know what was there that was being attacked. And the use of cluster munitions, you would think that it's generally going after relatively light-skinned items. Perhaps air defence. There may still have been some air defence there in what they were looking for. There are reports now that Ukrainians have, in, I believe, a different attack to this one, or this could be the footage from here, made a successful attack on a S-400 or a component of an S-400 system. The S-400 system, I don't believe was operational, was undergoing maintenance at the time, which, if that was the case, sounds to me like the perfect time to try to attack one of them, which is what appears to have happened, and that was successful. My understanding is, I don't know how many elements of the S-400 air defence system were destroyed. I believe it may have been a radar, which is perhaps the most valuable piece of the system, but those air defence systems aren't single units. They have multiple launchers with the missiles on them. They have a control centre on the back of a truck. They have a radar centre. They have power supplies, all of these sort of things. So as to exactly what units were destroyed or damaged in that attack, I'm not sure. And again, taking out an S-400 it's a vital piece of equipment, but it's not something that's going to change the face of the war. Just because the Russians have the ability to rebuild and replace these, the Russians have a lot of air defence systems, not just S-400s. And some other interesting news. You may have seen all of the noise going on about the online conflict between Ukraine's Vladimir Klitschko, who is a former heavyweight world champion, and YouTuber Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan was interviewing someone earlier in the week and basically had said that he thought Zelensky was wrong in his assumption that the West should be supporting him and all of that, this sort of thing. So, yeah, a lot of sort of, I think, a fair common sense position Rogan was probably taking. I haven't watched all of the Rogan interview. I've just seen the highlights. I have, though, listened to Klitschko's Twitter response, where he put together a short film as a response. You need to, I think, just remember here, let's just have a look at this, that Vladimir Klitschko, this is footage of him being congratulated by Victoria Nuland after becoming the mayor of Ukraine. Vladimir Klitschko operates under the control of the United States. You may recall from 2014 the leaked phone call from Victoria Nuland. We're in there where she was speaking and said, good, I don't think Klitschko should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. And it was basically a phone call of her conveying who the US State Department felt should be going into politics in Ukraine and who should be taking the positions of power. It's one of the clear examples of the 2014 Maidan coup being influenced by the Americans. Anyhow, so there's now this sort of a little bit of a tit for tat starting up on X between Klitschko and Joe Rogan. I personally think that they should probably sort it out in the ring somewhere with just no rules, and I'm pretty sure that Joe Rogan would win the conflict. Remember that Joe Rogan is a experienced judo person and a grappler. Klitschko is a big, heavy puncher, so I imagine that Rogan would get under that big punch and then would bring him to the ground. Anyhow, that's just my take on their boxing or their martial arts styles. But interesting. If you haven't seen it, go and check on X for Klitschko's response to Joe Rogan. Now, in terms of the ongoing attempts by the West to poke the bear, there are reports now that discussions are underway that the Brits and the French are not ruling out sending troops to Ukraine. This is apparently planning in response to the fact that they feel that Donald Trump is likely to withdraw support for Ukraine sometime in 2025 after he takes office in January. From the French newspaper Le Monde, I'll just read a little bit here. The debate about sending troops to Ukraine, which French President Emmanuel Macron initiated at a meeting between Kiev's allies in Paris in February, was strongly opposed by some European countries, led by Germany, and we will get to maybe why a little bit later in the episode. However, it was relaunched in recent weeks thanks to the visit to France of the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer for the November 11 commemorations. Discussions are underway between the UK and France on defence cooperation, particularly with a view to creating a hard core of allies in Europe focused on Ukraine and wider European security, confided a British military source to Le Monde. These are comments in line with those made by the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, on a visit to London on the 22nd of November, earlier this week. In an interview with the BBC on the 23rd, he called on Western allies to not set and express red lines in their support for Ukraine. When asked about the possibility of sending French troops into the field, he declared, "We do not discard any option." So this is the French Foreign Minister. I have subsequently heard that in the detail that these discussions are talking more about sending in peacekeeping forces if there is a negotiated ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, negotiated or approved by Donald Trump. I think the challenge with this is that Russia's not looking for a ceasefire. Russia is looking for a conclusion to this operation, the special military operation, and I believe that will be negotiated on their terms. So if a ceasefire isn't something they're looking for, then there won't be the need for peacekeeping forces to be sent in. So this may just be hollow noise from Macron and Starmer, which is quite possible. Also, on the other hand, it may backfire. If they're talking about putting troops in, if they're talking about doing it just themselves or forming this hard core of allies, is that to be separate to NATO? Because NATO, obviously people like Viktor Orban, President of Hungary, is unlikely to support such a thing. Slovenia as well, Fico. There are elements within the European nations, NATO and EU, who wouldn't support such a move. And so this may lead, as I suggested in a video the other day, to fractures within NATO and the EU if it's pushed too far. When I thought about why the Brits and the French are talking about this, I asked the question to myself, why? What do the UK and France gain from this? And then I thought, I'll ask Grok. So for those of you who don't know, Grok is X's AI engine like ChatGPT or Gemini that Google has. So it came up with a sort of standard expected responses. When I asked it, what do the UK and France have to gain from all of this? It said, well, influence and leadership in the European security, deterrence against Russian aggression. Here, I think, is the assumption, which I'll get to a little bit later on too, is the assumption that Russia wants to go and conquer Europe, which there is zero evidence for. Strengthening the European defence autonomy. Now, this is where I think this may be misguided. I think there's a real risk that them trying to form a hardcore group of allies is likely to lead to rifts and cracks within NATO and the EU. Training and military cooperation, I guess so. I imagine the French and the Brits already engage in some sort of annual training and military cooperation. Strategic ambiguity. Now, this is one that might get thrown around. This is where they're talking about keeping the option of troop deployment open provides strategic ambiguity, which can be a political and military tool. It might keep adversaries guessing about Western intentions and possibly giving European leaders more leverage in negotiations or peacekeeping efforts. I guess that's possible, but if you are negotiating with Russia and Russia is winning and is pushing all the way to the Dnieper River, which is as far as they would want to go, then I don't think you get much value out of the strategic ambiguity of perhaps France and UK sending peacekeeping forces. Geopolitical stability is what one of the sixth item that Grok suggested. Again, I don't think that that's legitimate. I think if anything, it's the opposite, in that the UK and France pushing and fighting further against Russia is likely to lead to geopolitical instability. Finally, the last one, which is, I think, probably the most likely one, or most likely to be a valid reason for why the UK and France are doing this. Item 7 that Grok suggested is economic and defence industry benefits. Engaging in Ukraine could lead to contracts for defence equipment, training and maintenance, benefiting the defence industries. It could also stimulate economic activity through defence spending and partnerships. To me, that sounds like the most logical reason here. It aligns well with what I spoke about yesterday, which was where US Senator Lindsey Graham has sort of said the quiet part out loud, that Russia can't be allowed to win and hold this territory in the east of Ukraine because there's $1 trillion worth of resources in the ground there, and that shouldn't be allowed to go to Putin. My understanding is that he thinks it should be allowed to go to America via corporations like BlackRock and Vanguard, who reportedly have already, or have previously, I should say, prior to the war, purchased rights to some of this land from the Ukrainian government. Anyhow, as I was saying before, and this leads me back to another point here, where there is a flaw in the thinking here, but this is what's publicly being suggested by the French and UK and NATO. From France's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, we will support Ukraine as intensely and as long as necessary. Why? Because it is our security that is at stake. Each time the Russian army progresses by 1 square kilometre, the threat gets 1 square kilometre closer to Europe, he said. And so this to me is the frightening aspect of what's going on here, in that a flawed argument like this is being used to incite nations to get deeper into war. Now, the cost of that will be economic ruin for countries within Europe. Thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands. If it becomes a fully fledged war in Europe, millions of lives lost. And so I ask the question, how can the Western leaders have it both ways? Either Russia is almost out of men, missiles, money, and the economy is about to collapse, and therefore no threat to Europe and no ability to conquer Europe, or they are a superpower with capabilities far beyond what we've ever imagined, making the conquest of all of Europe within their grasp. It's got to be one or the other. It can't be both. I certainly don't think that there is any evidence at all that Russia wants to conquer Europe. I've just not seen any of it. I've read through Putin's essay that he wrote about reasonings for for this conflict. You can go back and check earlier on the channel. That video's there where I read through the whole thing. Have a good read through that. He's talking about his concern for the relationship between Ukraine and Russia and the fact that the West is pitting brother against brother. That's the impression that he takes there. There's no talk of wanting to conquer Europe. But this is what the UK and France are using to try to incite more war. And again, you keep asking the question why, and maybe the question is as simple as, well, if they can push and get their nations to feel that they need to go to war, then they will get support to spend government funds, i.e. taxpayer dollars, on the military-industrial complex. They will be able to purchase more weapons and they'll be able to pay those companies to deliver more planes and weapons and ships and all that sort of thing to the war need. So that's what's going on there. Let's just step away for a moment from that, talk a little bit about how this is going to have an impact and already having an impact on the economies of Europe. Start with Germany. So thanks to the Ukraine conflict and the energy sanctions, German steel manufacturer ThyssenKrupp is to cut 11,000 jobs in its steel unit. ThyssenKrupp AG's steel unit plans to reduce its labour force by about 40% by 2030. This is from Dennis Grimm, a spokesperson for ThyssenKrupp Steel Europe, TKSC, Executive Board. Tough cuts are necessary. We have to become more profitable. The current market situation has deteriorated again in recent months, and unfortunately, there is no recovery in sight. Now, a large reason behind this is the increase in energy prices that these steel manufacturers are facing. The ability to produce steel requires vast amounts of electricity to generate the heat, to melt the steel, this sort of thing, to go through the processing. So that's the steel industry in Germany. Volkswagen intend to close at least 3 plants in Germany and downsize all remaining factories. The chairwoman of the Works Council, Daniela Cavallo, told employees the closure could result in the losses of tens of thousands of jobs. Entire departments may be closed. This is from Politico. I'll just read a couple of paragraphs about this. Volkswagen last month cancelled a 1994 agreement that protected its workers from layoffs until 2029, enabling business-related layoffs from mid-2025. With sales in China declining almost 20% in the first half of 2024, Volkswagen, which is heavily invested in the Chinese market, is left with few options to make up for its monetary shortfall, making the plant closure an obvious target. Volkswagen's historic plant closures come as Germany's gross domestic product is set to shrink for the second year in a row. The country's growing economic difficulties are likely to become a key issue ahead of a federal election scheduled less than a year from now, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is preparing for an industry summit to be held at the Chancellery on Tuesday, where he, with labour union bosses and the chiefs of some of Germany's biggest companies, is expected to try to come up with a plan to revamp the country's economy. Now, let's just have a quick look here between the Russian and German industrial production performance. Now, this is coming from a website called tradingeconomics.com, so you can go and have a look at that if you want to. But this is Russian industrial production for effectively the last year. And you can see that here there are blue bars that are all pointing upwards. This is indicating positive months of industrial production in Russia. Now let's have a look at the German equivalent. And this is the same time frame, and these are yellow bars that are all pointing down. This is a year of negative industrial production in Germany. So when you have a look at these two very different graphs and consider that industrial production is a massive part of the economy of both of these nations, you were given the impression that the Russian economy is doing well and the German economy is doing very poorly. It does make you question whether the Western sanctions have had the desired effect or if they have backfired upon the economies of Europe. All right, now here's one to really brighten your day. The head of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, has been reported as saying in the last couple of days, NATO is discussing the launch of preemptive high-precision strikes on the territory of Russia. He's quoted as saying, "It is more competent not to wait, but to hit the launches in Russia in case Russia attacks us. What is needed is a combination of precise strikes that will disable the systems used to attack us, and we must strike first." Now, remember, this is NATO Admiral Rob Bauer. Ukraine isn't in NATO, at least not formally, not officially. But he's saying, it is more competent not to wait, but to hit the launches in Russia in case Russia attacks us. We must strike first. They are reconsidering their purpose as a defensive entity, which again has always been the big claim as to why this was Russian aggression going into Ukraine, because NATO is purely defensive and would never look to attack anyone. Here we have the head of NATO saying what is needed is a combination of precision strikes that will disable the systems used to attack us, and we must strike first. Doesn't sound defensive. I'll just read a little more here. NATO is discussing the possibility of preemptive precision strikes on the territory of Russia in the event of an armed conflict with the alliance countries. This was stated at a conference in Brussels by the head of the military committee of the bloc, Admiral Rob Bauer. He called positive the fact that NATO has changed its attitude to the essence of the organisation as a defensive alliance, as well as the perception that it is necessary to sit and wait for us to be attacked and only then react. And again, his quote there, where it is more competent not to wait. As reported by EA Daily, where I'm reading this from, the probability of a Russian attack on one of the NATO countries, including Poland or the Baltic states, is estimated to be low. This was stated in an interview with the PAP by the head of the alliance's military committee, Rob Bauer. So on one hand, Rob Bauer is stating, look, the likelihood of a Russian attack on Poland or the Baltic states is low, which is what I'm suggesting, and a lot of people are far smarter than I'm suggesting. John Mearsheimer, for one, if you're not aware of John Mearsheimer, go to YouTube and just search his name and watch all of his videos. Watch the old ones too from 2014 when he gives a pretty good prediction of what was going to happen in Ukraine. So even Rob Bauer is saying there's a very low likelihood that Russia is going to strike these NATO nations. And yet, on the other hand, he's saying we need to change our stance. We need to become an aggressive, offensive organisation, and we need to strike the Russians first. It is exactly this sort of unfounded nonsense that is going to, if not careful, lead to a war in Europe, and lead to a war in Europe that will kill tens or hundreds of thousands of Russians and will kill hundreds of thousands of millions of Europeans, and for no good reason. Honestly, for no good reason other than probably at the heart of it, there is a desire for the Western nations to retain control on those eastern oblasts of Ukraine where that $1 trillion or more of resources are lying in the ground, which are reportedly owned by BlackRock and Vanguard, and who those companies have a very strong pull on the leadership of the Western nations of the US, the France, and the UK, that sort of thing. All right, I'm going to leave it there for today, but plenty to think about, particularly the sanctions and how well they might be working in terms of crippling Russia and empowering the European economies.